Good afternoon from a very sunny London. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much to everyone in the UNCAC Coalition for their hard work getting us to where we are today. I'm going to talk about the beneficial ownership aspects of this, which Helen's already alluded to. So before we get into that though, let's just take a quick look at kind of where we're at on the issue of beneficial ownership transparency around the world. To date, 112 countries have committed to some form of beneficial ownership transparency. That is a great figure, and we've come an extremely long way in a very short period of time to reach that. These are the countries who've done that. Very good geographical spread, notable exceptions throughout, as you can see on screen. To get into what we're aiming for here, what our goal as open ownership is, it's this, that we have license-free company ownership information. That is, in our case, the information about who ultimately owns and controls a company, available for free for everyone who needs it. Governments, tax authorities, investigative journalists, civil society, critically business to perform due diligence. As Helen already mentioned, there are pleasingly mentions of transparency related to beneficial ownership in this political declaration, which is a significant step forward in the UNCAC context, and that's fantastic to see. But that step forward, I think, still leaves UNCAC feeling pretty out of date with where the world is at now. So if we look at paragraph 16, which largely relates to beneficial ownership, or in fact entirely relates to beneficial ownership, these are 2 of the 19 mentions of transparency that Helen spoke about earlier. So it's good to see that there is mention of this at all, but it is a confused set of mentions. There is transparency mentioned in the first instance here, which may mean disclosure to a central authority, to government, but not necessarily to the public. And then the kind of caveated additional reference to transparency a little further down, such as through appropriate registries where consistent with fundamental principles of domestic legal systems, which is fair enough. And I understand the consensus-based nature of UNCAC means we have to include those caveats within it. But here's the challenge. I don't really know what this is aiming for. I'm not sure what this mentions of transparency about beneficial ownership really mean within this political declaration, and therein lies the problem. And this isn't a criticism. Again, it's a consensus-based fora. The caveats are necessary, but I'm really not sure what the intention is here. And there's another thing that's really important and critical, something that's missing. What's missing from any of this language is a really important word about actually using this data. Yes, it needs to be available and accessible to competent authorities, but accessible and unused data is a burden without any value. So the absence of this information actually being put to good use in tackling corruption, I think, is a major oversight, and sort of one that often gets forgotten about in this space. So on the specific beneficial ownership paragraph, good progress, good to see transparency there. I'm not entirely sure what it all adds up to. However, there is something else that's interesting, I think, in the sections on public contracting. So this is paragraph 11, and Kristen's already covered a lot of this. There's mentions of legal persons that have been determined to have committed acts of corruption, and some further reference to registries around that. Now, I found myself, again, slightly confused by this. It's good to see the relationship between legal and natural persons, beneficial owners relating to public contracting. We, Open Contracting, and many others have been pushing for that type of disclosure. But I'm just not quite sure if this just relates to COVID-19 and responding to a pandemic, or if this is something to do with the disbursement of all public funds and the sale of public assets, procurement, natural resources, and grants, etc. Some of this language mimics some of the work the IMF has done on including beneficial ownership disclosure commitments as part of the conditions on its IMF rapid credit facility. But what I would sort of say to everyone here is there's room to push here, room to push the principle that where public money is being spent through whatever mechanism, beneficial ownership is disclosed publicly. Not just transparency in a way that we don't really understand the meaning of it, but actually disclosed publicly. So again, what's the intention here? Quite promising, quite interesting, but I'm still a bit unclear. I just want to end with this. What are the kind of advocacy points I think we collectively need to make? Well, I think UNCAC risks being left behind and feeling outdated on beneficial ownership. FATF, many of the other international bodies are pushing ahead and moving forward. But the UN system has a vital role to play in pushing beneficial ownership transparency and delivering on its impact. And one of those roles is to make sure that the international rules that are being set by bodies like FATF, which is really just for those OECD member countries, are not simply developed and signed off by the world's richest countries. The UN system, and the FACTI panel has made this point very, very clearly, needs to play a pivotal role. And at the moment, it simply isn't. So just to finish off, what is the ambition that I would love to see for UNCAC? Well, that there be strong language on central, verified and shared data on all entities and their ownerships. That's the new global minimum standard. That public access to data is a real benefit to tackling corruption. And that the language in paragraph 10, which I haven't shown you on screen, but talks about effective data, usable data, there's no reason that shouldn't be replicated in the beneficial ownership space. It's the same principle, it's the same objective. And finally, to come back to this point on use, none of that matters if this information, this data is not put to use by governments and law enforcement. So the absence of language on that, for me, is a significant oversight. Thank you for listening.